Hello, friends. I am Igor Gavryshchak from Channel 24. Today, June 12th, I will be broadcasting live with military expert David Sharp from Israel. David, hello. Hello, Igor. David, today, December 12th, there was a big interview in The Times which named the future president of the United States, Donald Trump, as the Man of the Year. I'm wondering how you can nominate the Man of the Year of someone who hasn't done anything yet, but that's another matter. He's talked a lot about Russia's war in Ukraine, the Middle East, Israel, including suggesting to Netanyahu that the war should be stopped. We'll talk about all of that, but first of all, I'd like to ask you, David, what and how will Trump do about Ukraine?
делать Трамп в отношении Украины. Потому что вот этом интервью он сказал следующее, что
Because in that interview, he said he would not abandon Ukraine because it is the only leverage Russia has to stop the war. He also said that he is against the Ukrainian armed forces using ATACMS, a U.S. weapon, on Russian Federation territory because it would allegedly lead to escalation. How can this be explained?
Напугать, да, или настораживать, потому что мы считали, якобы Байден дал разрешение, и он это...
How much should this alert or frighten us? We thought Biden had authorized it and Trump had discussed it. But now we see that's not quite the situation. Yes, Biden had no need to coordinate with Trump. He could have put him on notice, but he didn't need to ask for authorization. In fact, if Trump takes this approach with the ban on ATACMS strikes, it will be a return to Biden's policy of banning their use for a long time and only authorizing them at the last minute, and then with certain restrictions. But that's not the main issue. The main question is whether ATACMS strikes on Russian territory will be authorized. This is important but not the most important. More important is whether Trump will decide to try to seriously pressure Ukraine or use the...
Самое главное упирается в то, решит ли, кроме возможного давления, попыток уговорить или попыток серьезно придавить Украину.
Other methods of pressure, which is still unclear. Will there be an impact on Russia? Because if the impact is only on Ukraine, it will play into Russia's hands and will not lead to anything good, to put it mildly. If Trump tries to reach an agreement that does not suit Ukraine without serious pressure on Russia, the result will be a failure. Putin now feels a certain confidence. He has a margin of safety in strategic terms. He has not run out of Soviet stocks, such as tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles, which will last for another year and a half at a high rate of losses. The economy has not yet cracked, and against the backdrop of territorial gains and the fact that the West is increasingly talking about the need to force Ukraine to compromise, Putin has no reason to rush into an agreement. He may assume that he will always have time to do it on more favorable terms. He can be stopped either by failures on the battlefield that require increased U.S. aid or by tough measures that the U.S. president can enforce. I have two main aspects in mind: the threat of tougher sanctions, serious sanctions against Russia, economic sanctions that would be stifling, and more aid to Ukraine, including in terms of numbers and permits, and a shift away from a policy of avoiding confrontation with Russia. These two levers would become very serious if Putin realized that this is what awaits him in the next 4 years if he doesn't compromise. A lot depends on President Trump here. If his actions match his words, if he resorts to a strategy of pressuring Russia, we can expect increased accommodation on Putin's part. On the contrary, if there are only words without significant leverage, Putin will act based on his own considerations and margin of safety. That's probably the case.
можно ожидать от нее повышенной сговорчивости. И наоборот, если будут одни слова и без существенных рычагов, Путин будет действовать в соответствии с своими соображениями.
There's a lot of talk now about a possible ceasefire, including Polish politicians and European officials. But I'll remember what Peskov, and not only him, said. He mentioned the conditions on which Putin was willing to negotiate. That was in June of this year, and among these conditions were restrictions on the Ukrainian army, the return of the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russian language, and television channels. We understand that under such conditions, not to mention the demand for recognition of the annexation of Ukrainian territories, such conditions only suggest the possibility of a future, even stronger strike. First, the ultimatums he has voiced, including the surrender of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions, the right bank of the Dnieper, and a host of other conditions, are not only a consolidation of his victory, if they are realized, but also provide him with a serious springboard for a future attack on Ukraine, if he so desires.
Ультимативные требования, в том числе и сдачу Запорожской, Херсонской областей, в том числе и на правобережье, как несложно догадаться, Днепра, и множество других условий.
Also, in addition to these horrendous territorial concessions he is demanding, are restrictions on the army and on the possession of certain weapons, things that could hinder him in the future. That is what he wants to stipulate.
Кроме, собственно, вот этих ужасающих территориальных уступок, которые он требует, это именно те или иные ограничения на армию, либо на владение тем или иным оружием, то есть то, что может ему помешать, как раз это-то он хочет и оговорить.
Unless Ukraine joins NATO and enters into an Article 5 agreement with the US, its security, other than territory, has no reliable guarantees.
Важнейшей составляющей, когда мы говорим о гарантиях украинских, если Украину не принимают в НАТО, и либо Украина не заключает, скажем, с Соединенными Штатами соглашение уровня 5 статьи в НАТО, когда американцы вмешиваются своей силой в случае нападения, то важнейшей, а этого, видимо, не происходит, то важнейшей гарантией безопасности...
If the size of the armed forces or their armament, such as missiles, aviation, and so on, is significantly limited, it means that the guarantees will be much worse, and in fact they will no longer exist.
Теми или иными ракетами, авиацией и так далее будет существенно ограничено, это означает, что гарантии будут гораздо хуже, и гарантий уже нет.
Russia is just preparing the ground. A stronger country with a larger army also restricts Ukraine's army in various ways. For what? We all understand perfectly well. Therefore, when we talk about the conditions voiced by Putin, these restrictions on the size and capabilities of the armed forces are one of the most important aspects. Everything. Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian authorities should understand these points. For those who do not understand or have doubts, logical and clear explanations should be given as to what this may mean and what consequences it may lead to. Of course, this kind of clarification should first and foremost be given to Western allies, importers, those who do not understand or pretend not to understand, including the American administration. There are principles that simply cannot be neglected, not because it is bad, but because it can lead to catastrophic consequences in the future. David, please tell me, how realistic do you think it is that some agreements will be signed in the next month or two? It's not even clear under what conditions, ceasefire on some part of the front or something else. How dangerous is this? Or are there still options that can ensure Ukraine's security in the long term? Ukraine's security can only be ensured by one main option, the strength of its own armed forces. This is what gives security, either complete or relative. Without armed forces capable of threatening an aggressor in a variety of ways, including on its territory, the aggressor has much more incentive to repeat or continue aggression. This is the most important thing. Naturally, some form of security guarantees, or let's say security cooperation with allies. And here we must understand what is a guarantee and what does not fit this definition. The guarantee is NATO membership, or something equivalent to NATO membership. Everything else is not guarantees. Everything else is promises of help of one kind or another, either firm or not so firm, which is very important but can't be a 100% or 99% hurdle. In any case, here and there, the power of the armed forces is important, and this applies to all aspects, including numbers. On the likelihood of contacts between the parties, this is what vision, for example, the future President Trump might have laid out to President Zelensky, but we don't know about it. That is, there may have been some events that we are not aware of, and this may bring some kind of agreement closer or farther away. If we rely on open sources, it is important for the conclusion of an agreement that all parties, let's say, feel pressure. But this is a specific tool. And of course, first of all, on Russia. A lot depends on this, whether Putin will feel that it is time for him to act or not. For that to happen, the American president must go beyond words with regard to Russia. That's what we'll see, because it's difficult to predict such things, especially given the behind-the-scenes moments that may be happening or have already happened. It is difficult to predict how the future president, a very specific politician, will act decisively. How practical his actions will be is also difficult to predict. In general, it makes no sense to predict, but it makes sense to listen to what he is saying now. After all, this is not an election campaign today, but until he is in power, it is too early to draw conclusions. By the way, I'd like to say 2 words about how he was elected Man of the Year. Apparently, his winning the election is definitely the event of the year, no matter how you look at it, even by a wide margin. I no longer recall Barack Obama, or rather, I recall that Barack Obama managed to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize without him lifting a finger. But life has shown what actions and the impact he had on the world. I can't rate them highly, but whether Trump will confirm his recognition as Man of the Year is an interesting question. We'll see how he uses his opportunities. I would also like to recall the situation in Syria and the events of the last 2 weeks. There, in fact, a whole era has come to an end, and Bashar al-Assad. There is footage of rebels trampling Putin's portraits. By the way, the troops are fleeing, and the rebels are waving their hands and making obscene gestures in their wake. But still, some contingent remains. I understand that Russia is simultaneously recognizing Bashar al-Assad, giving him asylum, and recognizing the new government in Syria. David, how unexpected was this for Russia? In Turkey, they say they knew about the preparations for the operation 6 months ago. Erdogan said recently that there were only 2 serious politicians left, him and Putin. But why didn't he share information with Putin about the offensive? Or did Putin know and not care because he is not interested in the region? He's interested in the region. If it didn't, they would have withdrawn from Syria without waiting for an offensive. But this is not about whether Putin should know or someone else. This kind of thing should be assessed by intelligence. And in general, intelligence has to assess the situation, including Russian, Iranian, and Bashar al-Assad's intelligence, and identify threats. And the command, based on the intelligence judgment and its own approach, should make decisions. Intelligence doesn't always provide accurate information. Commanders are preparing for war, and the president does not necessarily know all the details until crucial events or threats are reported. Today, naturally, everyone will blame the losers. The Iranians and Syrians are already claiming that they were warned. But in reality, the rebels have been preparing for war and the resumption of hostilities for years. Thoughts of revenge have never left them. The question is how far their plans extended. Most likely, they were close to realization, and they dreamed of blitzkrieg and complete defeat of the enemy. And a defeat, including the Iranians and Russians, in terms of strategy. Because unlike the US or the USSR in Afghanistan, neither of them, the Iranians and Russians, made the decision to abandon their ally and leave, letting him deal with the problems on his own. No, they stayed put and lost with the ally, resulting in a defeat for the war as a whole. And together with this, they were not ready for a new turn of events. All of this was unexpected for them. And once again, I repeat that perhaps someone was going to attack, but most likely it was of a localized nature. The whole course of events was unpredictable. And to predict the collapse of the enemy, which on paper is much stronger, a rare person could seriously. However, life can be different. In terms of overall priority, Putin has prioritized Ukraine in his military policy since 2022. It was important before that, but before that, there was no large-scale fighting, and largely because the war in Ukraine quickly took an undesirable turn for Putin. Aid to Syria was cut, the contingent was weakened, and Russia was unable to come to the rescue quickly. Even if it had wanted to, there was no opportunity to help. The refusal to help Syria weakened efforts in Ukraine, and there was no time to help quickly. This is a key aspect of what happened. Those who wanted to help had almost no time or resources. Israel played an important role by defeating Hezbollah and attacking Iran. We know that pro-Iranian forces were heavily dependent on Bashar al-Assad. I'd also like to ask you about the following that Trump said in this interview. He suggested to Netanyahu that the war in the Gaza Strip should end by January 20th. How realistic is that to end the war in that time frame? And also, Trump was asked about Iran being a threat. He was asked if there could be a war between the U.S. and Iran. He said anything is possible. The situation with Iran is a key Middle East policy issue in the months ahead, especially in the context of Trump's cadence. As always, I say, it will be very important how Trump's dealings with Iran develop. This is economic need, the threat of force, perhaps even the use of military force against Iran. How sympathetic will the Trump administration be to Israel's plans and actions with respect to Iran? Because today, in light of the new administration and in the context of the geopolitical situation, very favorable conditions are being created. Let's not say unprecedentedly favorable, although it is difficult to predict how the situation will develop further. Even a radical solution to the Iranian issue is possible. However, the overthrow of the regime, which cannot be counted on. One can hope, but Israel cannot topple the regime on its own. The regime has to be toppled from within, no matter how one looks at it, or in the case of a full occupation, but a full occupation of Iran is apparently not on the agenda for the Americans. So overthrow or not, solving the Iranian issue militarily is on the agenda. Iran is dealing with very important issues. The Assad regime is an important strategic asset for Iran, the loss of which has weakened its capabilities against Israel and the U.S. Hezbollah has been defeated, its capabilities are now limited, and it is not certain that it will stand up to Iran. Hamas is defeated and no longer poses a threat as a fighting force and missile capability. Iran has weakened its core forces, although something remains. Much depends on the situation in the region, and Trump will play an important role. As for ending the war in Gaza, those are words, of course. The U.S. president can indeed press Israel quite substantially after January 20th. Israel, however, is obliged in that case in Gaza to adhere to at least the minimum of its national security interests. My view is that the war in Gaza, the war against Hamas in general, can take many forms, including low intensity. Yes, it is no longer very intense today, but it should never stop, no matter who says what. Trump, whatever deals are made, there may be a break, there may not be a break, but the Israelis must not take any chances in this situation. Wherever two Hamas activists are gathering, wherever they're preparing something, they should be reached, whether it's in another Middle Eastern country or in the Gaza Strip. You can call it a war, you can call it a ceasefire, but Hamas should not feel safe anywhere, in any form. Even more so, there should not be a situation where Hamas receives some kind of security guarantees and develops its military capabilities under the cover of those guarantees. Israelis from October 7, 2023 can say they got burned, and that is to say nothing. A repeat of October 7th, or even a hint of it, is unacceptable. And since that is the case, then any Hamas person and any Hamas entity should be a target for destruction, wherever it is, whenever it is, if they can pose a danger, no matter what presidents say and no matter what happens, anywhere. David, I'd like to ask about something that Ukraine's partners are actively discussing right now. Even Macron flew to Poland today, December 12th, to talk to his colleagues, including Tusk, the prime minister, about a possible troop contingent in Ukraine. They have already talked about 4,000, that each partner country of Ukraine will form 1 or 2 brigades.
Уже говорили о 40 тысячах, что каждая страна, там партнеры Украины, будет формировать 1-2 бригады. Ну, Туск уже сказал, что
Tusk has already said that Polish troops will not be in Ukraine even after the ceasefire. But we understand that if you ask Poles, they are extremely opposed to this. The authorities will not go against the opinion of citizens. In general, I would like to ask, how realistically do you assess the likelihood of peacekeeping formations or international observers appearing in Ukraine? They are those people and structures that emerge only after the end of a war. That is, within the framework of a light truce or peace treaty. Peacekeeping formations are not those who enforce peace, not those who use physical force, and not those who fight on one side. If we stick to that definition, what is important here is not the fact that these formations are there, but the mandate they have. There is supposed to be a treaty between Russia and Ukraine, creating a buffer or demilitarized zone with observers. 40,000 is a lot, but the main thing is that these formations should really ensure Ukraine's security.
Но все упирается совершенно в другое. Это могут быть представители дружественных Украине стран, и желательно, чтобы это были, но важно понимать и четко определять, является ли это гарантией безопасности.
My answer is no. The fact is that there can be a guarantee of security only when you are guaranteed to intercede for you, to intercede on your side. That is, roughly speaking, NATO membership or an analog of NATO membership, for example, bilateral relations with the United States. Contingents, observers, and peacekeepers are, of course, good, sometimes even very useful. But if the enemy is more powerful and wants to attack you, experience shows that such contingents are not an obstacle. They will not stand up for Ukraine. They probably have no such desire, and their capabilities will be clearly limited as some kind of military force. All is well when they are there. They can record violations, they can perform useful functions, give self-confidence. Moreover, Russia may assume that by violating some ceasefire point and hitting these NATO representatives, it is taking a risk. This is also an important point. But the important thing is different. They are peacemakers, they are observers, they are not allies who will immediately intercede for you on the battlefield. So, it is important to keep that aspect in mind. And of course, the mandate is important. In any treaty, you have to read clearly and precisely what the contingent is, what its capabilities and powers are, and most importantly, the powers to prevent aggression, usually by the enemy. Usually these contingents do not have such powers, and this should always be remembered. David, if you talk about Trump's great desire to stop all wars during his presidency in the next 4 years, don't you think that might blind him enough to make things worse? He could freeze the conflicts, let them build up weapons, rebuild, and then, with renewed vigor, the wars will start after him, and he will keep in his head that there were no wars in his first term. First, the goal of ending, I won't say all the wars in the world, but at least the major wars and conflicts is an ambitious goal. Too ambitious. Very ambitious. I have great doubts that it is possible, even with the tools that the President of the United States has. The same Middle East conflict has many dimensions. This conflict is centuries old, and such wars are not resolved easily, although positive developments are possible. The important point is to end the war by forcing one side to make unacceptable concessions, or to create conditions under which one side does not realize its ambitions.
Надавив на правую сторону, на правота на чьей стороне, заставив кого-то.
Then a freeze might give her the opportunity to realize those ambitions. Freezing or forcibly signing peace treaties. The signing of some agreements, the end of some wars should be on the right terms.
Неправая сторона оказывается прижата в угол и зажата в угол, либо не реализовала свои амбиции, то заморозка может дать ей возможность эти амбиции реализовать. Заморозка или насильное подписание мирных договоров. Я к чему веду? Что подписание неких...
If they do not end on the right terms, it is not a solution to the problem, but the creation of uncomfortable conditions for one of the parties, and sometimes for several, which will be an incentive for a new war. And perhaps in more negative circumstances, sometimes in much more negative circumstances. There are many examples in history of wars ending with peace agreements, or surrenders, in which there was tremendous potential for further war, including World War I, and how it ended, how some of the defeated perceived the results, and what it led to. So yes, forcibly ending wars in quotes can sometimes be costly. So let's see what President Trump is called to do. Once again, the American president has the tools, and if he is determined, if he gets the right advice, he can do more good than harm. All that remains is to wait for real steps.
Еще раз скажу, инструменты у американского президента есть, если он настроен решительно, будет получать правильные советы, может быть больше пользы, чем вреда, остается только дождаться реальных шагов.
David, one last question. How much Europe, how much the individual member states of the alliance are prepared? We realize they can't become in place of the U.S. to help in the war against Russia. But here's the arrival and the preparation of the countries of Europe for Trump, who is very adamant that Europe must defend itself. How much will this affect the growth of the military-industrial complex of the old continent? How much can Europe really grow into a serious military power, not just an economic one, as it was before the full-scale invasion? Europe is fully a mass of countries with their own interests and different opportunities. To begin with, it is important that each country should treat the new strategic situation with responsibility and understanding. We can state that if we look back over the years, the majority of European governments did not have such an understanding of responsibility to a sufficient degree, although alarm bells have been ringing for a long time. These include Russian actions in Georgia, of course, Russia's attack on Ukraine in 2014, Crimea, Donbass, Russia's rhetoric and approaches, and China, which, although far from Europe, also looms large. Speaking of which, Trump's previous cadence when he told Europeans that they rely too much on the U.S. was right. He said, "How come you have such military budgets? You rely only on the United States." Then some people got a little excited, but just a little. The main thing is different. Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine, which was supposed to lead to a definitive change, led to only partial changes in the understanding of the situation.
Привело лишь к частичным сдвигам в понимании. Все равно в Европе считали, что мы НАТО и нам особо ничего не окружает.
Europe believed that they were not threatened by war, so the shift was slow. In a democracy, the most important thing for a politician is to be re-elected, and stimulating the military-industrial complex is an unpopular step.
Первое главное для любого политика это быть переизбранным, и чтобы избиратели не сказали ему нет, если он пойдет на непопулярные шаги, а стимулирование ВПК в ущерб чему-то другому это для.
So the shifts in Europe are slow, but there is potential in Europe economically, of course. And if there is more understanding, including when the U.S. president resorts not only to rhetoric, but also to deeds, decisions will be made faster. But unfortunately for them and for Ukraine, these decisions on building up the military-industrial complex and military measures have not been taken quickly enough. Unwinding this flywheel is a long and problematic process. Perhaps now it will accelerate in light of the circumstances. David, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you for taking the time to shed some light on Trump's decisions, on what we can expect and what we'd rather not have happen. Thank you very much. Thank you also. More good news. All the best.
Решение Трампа, чего ожидать и чего лучше бы не случилось. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо и вам, побольше хороших новостей, всего наилучшего.
Нагадаю нашим глядачам, з нами був ізраїльський військовий експерт.
Israeli expert David Sharp. Like, subscribe, comment, and share our conversation.
Поділіться нашою розмовою.
My name is Igor Gavryshchak. We'll meet on the air of Channel 24.